Hello folks, Dan here, back for another reading from the Song of Roland. In our last readings, Roland and his brother-in-arms Oliver, both boys of 12, had watched the host of Charlemagne as it passed by to be received as a guest in Sutri. Upon seeing the great Charles himself, Roland was overcome with feelings of wonder and destiny, and pledged to his friend Oliver that they would become knights, serving the great king, and perhaps even one of his peers. Roland then learned that he was in fact Charlemagne's nephew, for his mother Bertha was Charlemagne's sister. Bertha had fled an arranged marriage to be with her true love, Milan, a poor yet powerful warrior whom Charlemagne despised. Now that Roland was 12 and old enough to be a page, his mother told him that it was time to declare himself to Charlemagne and to be admitted to his court. Roland set off immediately that very next morning to do just that. Upon arriving at Charlemagne's feast the following day, Roland acted so boldly and expressed such clever wit that Charlemagne recognized the boy's future greatness, and Roland became a page in the king's court under Duke Namon, one of the king's peers. Let's return now to discover what became of Roland afterward. And now, the Song of Roland, Part 1. Roland and Oliver. 3. A Roland for an Oliver. Years later, when Roland had come to manhood, Charlemagne held high festival at Paris. It was in thanksgiving for the victories with which his arms had everywhere been blessed. Once more the foes of Christendom have been driven from Christian soil. Once more did peace and prosperity seem to smile upon France, and the king had summoned the worthiest barons and warriors of his realm to award to each some fitting recompense for his services and good faith. Among the knights who had come to Paris was old Count Gerard, the grandfather of Oliver, and one of the most powerful barons of France. He had come to renew his homage for his ancient fief of Vienna, and he hoped that the king, as a reward for his lifelong services, would grant him now the vacant fief of Burgundy. But for some reason, best known to himself, Charlemagne failed to invest him with the wished-for dukedom. Count Gerard rebelled against the king and declared that, for the affront which Charlemagne had offered him, he would no longer be his man nor pay him tribute. He shut himself up in the stronghold of Vienna, which he fortified and strengthened with great care, and made ready for a long and close siege. He sent also to his brother Miles of Apulia, and to his son Rainer of Genoa, craving their help. Miles came with 1,000 men bearing shields, and Rainer with 2,000 crossbowmen. With Rainer also came his son Oliver, boldest of warriors, and his daughter Alda, a beautiful Persian Peri, brave as a Saxon Valkyrie. Great indeed was the siege which Charlemagne placed around Vienna. None ever saw the like before, and he vowed that he would never leave it, nor give up the contest, until the proud Gerard should be humbled in the dust before him. Week after week passed by, and still the worrisome siege continued. Some say that Charlemagne was encamped around Vienna for 7 years, but I think it could not have been more than 7 months. Nevertheless, the whole country, for leagues on every side, was laid waste, and what had once been a blooming garden was now in a fair way to become a desert. The vineyards had been destroyed, the orchards had been cut down, the houses of the country folk had been burned and destroyed. Great indeed was the distress caused by this quarrel between the king and the count, but the distress fell upon neither king nor count, but upon the innocent and the helpless. Ah, how cruel is war! The king allowed neither wind nor rain to turn him aside from his purpose, or to make him forget his vow, and all winter long his men sat by their campfires and surlily guarded the approaches to Vienna. At length, however, Eastertide grew on apace, and the woods began to grow green again, and the flowers sprang up in the meadows, and the birds sang soft and sweet. And many knights bethought them then how idly and vainly their time was being spent in this fruitless war against one of their own number, and they longed to ride away in quest of other and more worthy adventures. The king tried hard to press the siege and to bring it to a speedy close, but in vain. The watchful and valiant crossbowmen held the besiegers at bay, and obliged them to keep their accustomed goodly distance from the walls. One day, a party of strange knights rode into the camp and asked to see the king without delay. They came from the mountain land which borders France on the south, and they brought stirring news which aroused the zeal of every local Christian warrior. Marsilius, the pagan king of Spain, they said, had crossed the Pyrenees with a great host of Saracens, and was carrying fire and sword in dire distress into the fairest provinces of southern France. Unless Charlemagne should come quickly to the help of his people, all Aquitaine and Gascony would be lost, and the pagans would possess the richest portion of his kingdom. The king was much troubled when he heard these tidings, and he called his peers together to ask their advice. All declared at once in favor of raising the siege of Vienna, of making some sort of peace with Gerard, and marching without delay against the invaders. But Charlemagne remembered that, before undertaking the siege of Vienna, he had vowed not to desist until Count Gerard was humbled in the dust at his feet. "I have an oath in heaven," said he, "and I must not break it. This traitor Gerard shall not be spared." "Which were better?" asked Duke Ganelin mildly. "To forget a vow which was made too hastily, or to sit here helpless and see all Christendom trodden under the foot of the accursed Saracens?" "It seems to me," said sage Duke Namalm, "that the present business must be speedily ended by leaving it to the judgment of God. Count Gerard knows nothing of the straits that you are in. He cannot have heard of this invasion by the Saracens, and he will gladly agree to any arrangement that will bring your quarrel with him to an honorable end. Let 2 knights be chosen by lot, one from each party, and let the combat between them decide the question between you and Count Gerard." Charlemagne and his peers were much pleased with this plan, and a messenger with a truce flag was sent into the fortress to propose the same to Count Gerard. The men of Vienna were not only heartily tired of fighting against the king, but they foresaw that if the siege were kept up much longer, they would be obliged to surrender for want of food, for their provisions were already beginning to run low. So they very gladly agreed to leave the whole matter to the decision of heaven, and, as they numbered among them some of the bravest and most skillful swordsmen in Christendom, they had little doubt but that the judgment would be in their favor. When the messenger came back to Charlemagne with Count Gerard's answer, the king and his peers at once drew lots in order to determine which one of their number should be their champion. The lot fell upon Roland, and to him was assigned the danger and the honor of maintaining the dignity and authority of the king, and of deciding a question which many months of warfare had failed to settle. Early the next morning, Roland was ferried over to an island meadow in the Rhone, where the Knight of the Red Plume, who had been chosen by the Viennese folk to oppose him, was already waiting. Roland was well armed, but instead of his own shield he carried another, which the king had given him, one wide and thick, but new and untried. Yet his good sword, Durendal the Terror, slept in its sheath by his side, and with it alone he would have felt sure of victory. The Knight of the Red Plume had armed himself with the greatest care. His war coat had been wrought by the famed smith, the good Jew Joachim, and was said to be proof against the stroke of the best-tempered sword. The hauberk which he wore was the one which King Aeneas, ages before, had won from the Greeks on the plains of Troy. His buckler was of fish skin from the great salt sea, stretched on a frame of iron, and hard enough to turn the edge of any common sword. On one bank of the river stood the friends of Roland, anxious to see how the young hero would acquit himself, and yet not at all fearful of the result. On the other side were Count Gerard and Miles and Rainer, and the bravest knights and the fairest ladies of Vienna. And among these last, the fairest of all was Alda, the daughter of Rainer, and the sister of Oliver. Very beautiful was she to look upon. A coronet of pearls encircled her brows, golden was her hair, which fell in rich ringlets upon her shoulders, blue were her eyes as the eyes of a moulted falcon, fresh was her face, and rosy as dawn of a summer's day. White were her hands, her fingers long and slender, her feet were well-shaped and small. The red blood had risen to her face. Eagerly she waited the beginning of the fray. Roland, when he saw her, trembled as he had never trembled before an enemy. The signal for the onset is given. The 2 knights put spurs to their steeds and dashed toward each other with the fury of tigers and the speed of the wind. The lances of both are shivered in pieces against the opposing shields, but neither is moved from his place in his saddle. Quickly, then, they dismount and draw their swords. How Durendal flashes in the light of the morning sun! Now does the helmet which the good Jew Joachim made do good service for the Red Plumed Knight. The fair Alda is overcome with fear. She hastens back to the castle. She goes to the chapel to pray and falls fainting at the foot of the altar. Never before has there been so equal a fight. For more than 2 hours, the two knights thrust and parry, ward and strike, but neither gains the better of the other. At last, however, the sword of the red-plumed knight is broken by a too lusty blow upon Roland's helmet. His shield, too, is split from top to bottom. He has neither wherewith to fight nor to defend himself, yet he has made up his mind to die rather than to be vanquished, and he stands ready to fight with his fists. Roland is pleased to see such pluck, and he scorns to take advantage of his foe's ill plight. "Friend," he said right courteously, "full great is your pride, and I love you for it. You have lost your sword and your shield, while my good Durendal has neither notch nor blemish. Nephew am I to the King of France, and his champion I am today. Great shame would be upon me were I to slay an unarmed man when he is in my power. Choose you now another sword, one to your own liking, and a more trusty shield, and meet me again as my equal." Roland sat down upon the grass and rested himself, while the red-plumed knight bade his squires bring him another sword from the castle. 3 swords were sent over to him, that of Count Gerard, that of Rainer the Genoese, and Hauteclair, a blade which the Jew Joachim had made, and which in old times had been the sword of Closimond the Emperor. The knight chose Hauteclair. Roland rose from the grass, and the fierce fight began again. Never were weapons wielded with greater skill. Never was there a nobler combat. The sun rose high in the heavens, and the noontide hour came, and still each knight stood firmly in his place, thrusting and parrying, striking and warding, and gaining no vantage over his foe. After a time, however, the patience of the red-plumed knight gave out. He grew furious. He was anxious to bring the combat to an end. He struck savagely at Roland, but the stroke was skillfully warded, and Hauteclair snapped short off near the handle. At the same time, Durendal, coming down with the force of a thunderbolt, buried itself so deeply in the shield of the red-plumed knight that Roland could not withdraw it. Both knights were thus made weaponless, but neither was vanquished. Wrathfully they rushed together to seize each other, to throw each other down. Moved by the same thought, each snatched the other's helmet and lifted it from his head. Some saw that a bright cloud and an angel came down between them, and bade them cease their strife. But I know not whether this be true, for, as they stood there, bareheaded, and face to face, memories of their boyhood came back to them. Both were struck dumb with astonishment for a moment. Roland saw before him his loved brother-in-arms, Oliver. Oliver, now no longer the red-plumed knight, recognized his old friend Roland. Then they rushed into each other's arms. "I yield me!" cried Roland. "I yield me!" cried Oliver. Great was the wonder of Charlemagne and his peers when they saw their champion thus giving up the fight when victory seemed assured. Equally great was the astonishment of the Viennese and of Oliver's kinsmen. Knights and warriors from both sides of the river hastened to cross the island. They were eager to know the meaning of conduct seemingly so unknightly. But when they came nearer and saw the men, who had fought each other so long and so valiantly, now standing hand in hand and pleading anew their faith as brothers in arms, everything was made clear. And with one voice, all joined in, declaring that both were equally deserving of the victory. This concludes the reading of the Song of Roland Part 1, Roland and Oliver. I hope that you've enjoyed it. We'll be back soon with more readings. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy out there.